The Old Testament is an enigmatic work. It is both a book of ancient history and a collection of rules that gave birth to a religion, Judaism. It is also the source of Christianity and, several centuries later, inspired the Quran, Islam's founding text. Its characters have accompanied the West for over 2,000 years. Our imaginations have been carried away by its stories. But what exactly is contained in this book? Where was it written, and by whom? Modern science has shown a new light on these questions on the basis of findings drawn from stones and from the land. A recent revolution in the area of archaeology has transformed the idea we once had of the society that put the Old Testament into writing. The investigation we are about to carry out was triggered by this revolution. The sun rises over the lands of Canaan. Lands where, according to the Bible, lived the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Our investigation is about to begin, at the beginning. Their stories are told in the first book of the Bible, Genesis. Israel Finkelstein, a researcher at the Archaeology Institute of the University of Tel Aviv, has had joint charge of excavations in Megiddo in the north of Israel for almost 10 years. About 100 specialists and volunteers from all over the world are involved in this undertaking. Megiddo is the jewel of biblical archaeology. Its history goes back over 7 millenniums of contacts and conflicts between the great powers that dominated the region in turn: Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon, followed by the Persian Empire. Megiddo is a tell, an artificial hill created from layers of homes, palaces, and temples that were built over each other during the centuries. The name Megiddo is often cited in the Bible. For Christians, it represents Armageddon, the site of the apocalypse. Many archaeological expeditions have been embarked upon on the basis of these biblical references. In 1903, the German archaeologist Gottlieb Schumacher organized the first digs here. vast quantities of material. In the 1920s to 30s, U.S. billionaire John Rockefeller financed an archaeological mission by the University of Chicago. The mission was aimed at carrying out a methodical investigation. Thanks to the hundreds of workers recruited at the site or in Egypt, the mission was able to reach bedrock in this huge trench, which measures 20 meters in width and is 15 meters deep.
This is a key for understanding the history of Megiddo and the history of the entire country. It is a unique opportunity which was given to us by earlier excavators. There's this incredible section going all the way down to bedrock, giving you a history of about 7,000 years, from bedrock down there all the way up to the 5th century BC. 20 strata, in fact more than that, 25 cities built one on top of the other. A unique situation. There's nothing like that anywhere else in the entire region, even beyond the borders of this country. And this opens a window for us into the belly of the mound and a window into the book, open book, the history of Megiddo in the Bronze and Iron Ages, and the history not only of Megiddo, the history of the entire country.
An unparalleled site that is the cradle of biblical archaeology, Megiddo serves as a reference for the dating of sites throughout the whole of the Near East. Located at a strategic and economic crossroads between Egypt, the Levant, and Mesopotamia, Megiddo is going to play a crucial role in our investigation. The Old Testament is the name commonly given to the Hebraic Bible. It is essentially a religious book. For many centuries, it was considered as being unnecessary and even dangerous to question the historical events related in its pages. This attitude would change as a result of what are known as the Lights. The Bible would undergo a rereading on the basis of tools provided by science and reason.
Mid-19th century Germany saw a critical exegesis of the Bible, which triggered reactions particularly in England. This ultimately led scholars to come to Palestine in an attempt to use archaeology in order to prove the historical veracity of the biblical texts.
Researchers, most often from European and U.S. religious circles, worked throughout the region looking for evidence to prove the historical nature of the Bible. They included Fathers Lagrange, Abel, and Vincent. Edward Robinson, a theologian trained in the Semitic languages, identified dozens of sites that have retained practically the same names for 2,500 years. These adventurers drew up the first biblical maps of the Holy Land. Little by little, methodical excavations were set up in the area. According to an expression popular at the time, the archaeologists carried a spade in one hand and a Bible in the other. They were the originators of both a method and a state of mind, biblical archaeology.
It would take quite some time before biblical archaeology fell out of favor. As late as the 1930s, the American archaeologist William Foxwell Albright was convinced that his archaeological research would enable him to prove the historical veracity of the Bible. And this movement continued practically until 1960.
The approach has still not completely disappeared. But in recent years, researchers have opened up a new path that has transformed archaeology into an independent scientific discipline. These specialists consider architectural vestiges, ceramics, and debris of all types as the elements in a huge tableau vivant, a human reality that has to be sampled, understood, and interpreted in scientific terms.
He was very satisfied that the trough is still in place. He thinks that it's nice and it should be kept in place. It's this one over here, this trough.
How has this new approach changed what we know about the origins of the Old Testament? This is the investigation being carried out by Israel Finkelstein in Megiddo and in the Levant's archaeological sites. Allowing these books of stone to shed light on a work of paper. The Bible is the world's most widely read book. Its specialists include exegetes, epigraphs, specialists in literature, linguists, historians, and theologians. Thomas Romer is a professor of the Old Testament at the Lausanne Faculty of Theology. He will be our guide with respect to this work.
What is the Hebraic Bible? First of all, it is obviously the founding text of Judaism. It is also the text that is at the origin of three monotheisms: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In more precise terms, it is the history of the Hebraic people, a national history that begins with the patriarchs and goes through to the royalty. But this national history also became a universal history through the prophets and by being opened up to other nations. So the Hebraic Bible is both a very specific book related to the Hebraic people and, due to its acceptance and enlargement, a book that carries a universal message.
The Old Testament is composed of a series of books, which is the very definition of the word Bible, ta biblia, which in Greek means the books. It is a collection of legal texts, poems, and moral reflections, and a history book of the creation of the world and the people of Israel. It was the first book ever to be printed. Like all great religious texts, it is a controversial document that has been used by some to justify wars and invasions, and by others to deliver a message of peace. Its wealth is such that it is never far from the minds of our archaeologists. It is not possible to carry out digs in the Holy Land without being conscious of the gravity of the situation. Israel Finkelstein, an archaeologist, and Neil Silberman, a historian, have decided to write a book together that will compare the discoveries made by archaeology with the most famous of biblical stories. They know they are embarking on a very sensitive mission.
The Bible, of course, is one of our most important ancient Near Eastern texts, but it's got a larger significance than that, obviously. It's a ancient text that is the core of the religion of hundreds of millions of people all over the world. So we are aware of the sensitivities of the Bible, but what we're trying to do is bring the most modern discoveries, the best insights that we can, to help the understanding and really transform the modern understanding of what the Bible really represents in its ancient context.
Their book provides the outline for our investigation and its chronology, from the most distant times to the most recent periods.
Voilà un des volumes de cette Bible ancienne du XVIIe siècle imprimée à Londres, les polyglottes que vous souhaitiez voir.
The first 5 books of the Old Testament make up what is called the Pentateuch, or the Torah in Hebrew. They are particularly important for those who proclaim monotheism and are common to both Judaism and Christianity.
The Hebraic Bible begins with a universal story. The first 11 chapters tell the story of creation, the creation of human beings and the world, and also the origin of violence. Cain and Abel, the flood, and the origin of the diversity of our languages and of humanity in the Tower of Babel. Then suddenly in chapter 12 we turn to something else, the story of Abraham and thus the origins of the Hebraic people, with this call that Abraham receives from God.
ויאמר אדוני אל אברהם, לך לך מארצך וממולדך ומבית אביך אל הארץ אשר אראך.
The Lord said unto Abraham, leave this land and your ancestors, the house of your father, and go to the land that I will show you.
The Bible describes the patriarch Abraham, his wife Sarah, and his nephew Lot leaving their land with their herds and heading for the Promised Land in response to a divine order. The biblical text describes a veritable migration over thousands of kilometers from Mesopotamia toward Egypt and then Canaan. In accordance with the Romantic and Orientalist conceptions of the period, 20th century researchers imagined Abraham as a Bedouin, similar to those that could then be seen in the Holy Land. According to them, the biblical story described a lifestyle that was typical of the region.
When scholars sought a date for the biblical patriarchs, they basically relied on a certain number of elements contained in the texts that took us back to around 1800 BC. This obviously means that they relied only on biblical facts and not on facts that were external to the Bible. Even today, many people imagine that Abraham lived around 1800 BC.
1800 BC is a period referred to by archaeologists as the Middle Bronze Age. We have to go back to Megiddo. What can the Book of Stone tell us about this? We will focus our investigation in the heart of the site, on the strata dating from the Middle Bronze Age. By going down to the lower pages of Megiddo, Israel Finkelstein takes us back in time. He arrives at the ruins of the city that corresponds to the second millennium. What he finds there is surprising. At that time, Megiddo was an important administrative, cultural, and economic center with monumental buildings, fortifications, and temples. Far from being an arid landscape suitable only for herders, the strata of the period corresponding to Abraham's migration reveal a city-state of almost 2,000 inhabitants. At that time, Canaan was an economically developed region with a very dense network of city-states. Doubts are raised about the chronology that has been proposed by traditional interpretations of the Bible. But what of the migration itself? Canaan is a buffer zone situated between Egypt and Mesopotamia, and these empires have left a number of vestiges. Megiddo is one of the sites where such material abounds. This Book of Stone will allow us to read the ancient pages of the history of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Pages that are indispensable to the rest of our investigation. In Canaan, archaeology is for the large part a science of broken fragments and shattered vases. Their decorative style, dating, and use are elements that come together like a huge puzzle in order to reconstruct these societies. These fragments teach us about the origin of power and the social groups active at that time. They suggest both distant and near influences, desires, fears, and daily life from the relevant time. Like these small engraved cylinders that were used as seals or amulets, and in which we can see the rites that were then popular in Mesopotamia and the Levant unfolding before our eyes.
At Megiddo, we have evidence for the influence of the northern powers, the northern civilizations, I mean Mesopotamian and Syrian, throughout history, from the late 4th millennium to the 1st millennium BC. This means that they had an impact on the events in the Levant throughout, and that it is impossible to reconstruct the history of this region without taking into consideration the northern civilizations, Mesopotamian and Syrian.
There are many links in the stories of the patriarchs with the people of the north, that is, the Arameans. We have Jacob and his uncle Laban, who ended up there, and we can see that they have family ties there, as well as more complicated conflictual links. Territories had to be mapped out, and it was not always an easy task. The north is also mentioned when Abraham is about to leave, as he comes from Haran, which was a very important Aramaic town.
The biblical text describes the migration of Abraham as a break with his own civilization. But is the hypothesis that the patriarchs originated in Mesopotamia a plausible one? One of the answers lies perhaps in the countless archives and testimonials of Mesopotamian civilization that are today to be found disseminated throughout the world's greatest museums. We have here a panorama of the civilization and empires that followed one another in Mesopotamia over the millenniums. Alongside these monuments that rise up from the sands, we find thousands of tablets covered in cuneiform symbols, writings in clay that cover several thousands of years, some of which date from the 2nd millennium BC. Will Neil Silberman be able to find the traces of Abraham's story in these tablets? The thousands of tablets dug up from the silt of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers form a gigantic database that has to be deciphered, a task that is still ongoing. In the 1920s, an English archaeologist, Leonard Woolley, began digs at Ur, the village where Abraham originated. A number of clues appeared to be quite conclusive. William Albright, a U.S. scholar, believed that he had identified the historical framework for the patriarch's story. He claimed that a vast migration, that of the Amorites, a nomadic people from Mesopotamia, led to the destruction of urban culture in the Levant around 2000 BC. Neil Silberman is at the School of Applied Higher Studies in Paris.
The early scholars attempted to place Abraham in a historic context of the Amorite invasions. But do we believe that this could be true today?
The Amorites are a people that are well documented at the end of the 3rd and beginning of the 2nd millenniums, and it was very tempting to link Abraham